As we wrap up our study on Second Thessalonians, we're going to spend some time talking about work, the painful work of church discipline, and the goodness of working with our hands. So, first, Paul is addressing the issue of idleness in the Thessalonian church. In his previous letter, he had addressed that specifically. Apparently, some people did not take heed of his warning, and they were continuing to persist in their sin of idleness. So, Paul is calling the church to do the painful work of church discipline. And church discipline is something that should be a struggle for us. It should not be something that we enjoy doing because we love our brothers and sisters in Christ and we love righteousness. So when someone is walking in sin, we're grieved because we know that that is not what is best for our brother or sister, and we know that it is a affront to God and his holiness. So we're grieved on multiple accounts. We're grieved because Christ is being misrepresented, and we grieve because it is actually harmful for our friend and our brother. So church discipline is a painful work. It should not be something that we find pleasure in doing, but it is something that we do out of faithfulness to both Christ, his church, and our brother and sister in Christ. So we approach church discipline with love and with gentleness, but firmness and boldness, with restoration as the goal, not condemnation. Our hope is to gain a brother, gain a sister. Our hope is not to expel them, but to restore them. So that is the painful work that Paul is calling the church to do. And I think church discipline really happens most effectively at Meadowbrook in life group, because most of church discipline is not handled on the church scale where we're expelling a member from the church. That should be very, very rare. Church discipline most likely happens in the one-on-one, one-on-two conversations, and the best place for those type of conversations to take place is in the fellowship of our life groups. So talk about that for a moment with your life group. Talk about the painful work that you're called to as life group members and to the lives of one another, and invite people into that type of ministry. And then transition to talking about work in general. You might want to outline for a little bit the threat of idleness. Why is idleness a big deal? Why is Paul dealing with it in the last letter and in this letter? Well, I think as we look at this passage, we can see it in this passage alone, but I think other passages as well help us understand why it's such a big deal. First, we were made to work and given work to do by God before the fall. So God created the garden and he placed man in it to work. So when we grow idle and lazy in our work and we choose not to work rather than working faithfully, what we're doing effectively is we're denying the goodness of God and his creation. So it's a big deal, something that we didn't think was tied to a denial of God's goodness and the goodness of what he has done. When we're lazy, we're effectively doing that with our actions. And then secondly, is that idleness is the opposite of wisdom, and it's actually harmful to you. So when we see Proverbs, are written to encourage people to walk in wisdom and live the good life according to God's commandments, we see that the idle path is the path of folly, and it leads to destruction. Whereas diligent work that is done in faithfulness unto the glory of God is the way of wisdom. And then lastly, we see in this passage that idleness is a breeding ground for other sin, particularly for busybodies and gossip in this instance, but it happens in other ways, pornography or financial foolishness or gambling in a way that is unbiblical, is unsteward use of their money, or gluttony. Whatever comes from idleness, it's never good. And then lastly, talk about what this labor should look like. Well, first, we should work quietly with our hands. We should not seek to be people pleasers. Secondly, we should seek to provide for our families through our work. The means of which God has provided or has put in place for us to be providers in our families is work. So we should not seek to avoid that work. Now we want to keep that in check with some, recognizing that there is some fallenness, there is brokenness that happens. People aren't able to work. They've lost their jobs. We want to handle this with very tact, wisdom, and kindness. But ultimately, God has provided work as a means for his people to provide for themselves, and we should do that. And then lastly, Paul gives one last final don't. He says, do not grow weary in doing good. Now, in the context of what we're talking about, there is a sense of which work can be tough at times, and we do not need to grow weary in our labor. But Paul's intent in this passage seems not to be just a charge to persevere in the work, but he's protecting against those who would take his words and twist them in such a way to alleviate them of any responsibility of serving the poor and the needy. I think commentator Gene Green really draws our attention to the meaning and context of this phrase "doing good" in the original language. You can read what he says, but ultimately what Paul is charging the people to do is to work quietly, provide for themselves, and not grow weary in their ministry to the poor and those who are destitute.